Let's talk with Paul in Texas. All right, Paul in Texas.
Hi.
You're on the air.
Hi, Paul.
What can we help you with today?
Hi. So I believe I have proof and or evidence of an omnipotent being.
Cool.
It's kind of a step-by-step process, and I just want to take it kind of slow and go as far as you want. But just where do you want to start with the proof or the evidence or the definitions, right?
Well, yeah, I think the best way to get started is kind of give us a sneak peek of like the final thing you're going to be trying to convince us of, and then we'll get into definitions and kind of how you got there. So what is this evidence that you're going to present?
Okay. So the goal is to present something akin to deism, an omnipotent deism, which can then step off to theism. But we just need to start with deism, because once deism is proven or evidence is shown, then atheism is falsified. It's taken off the table, and then
yes, and I want to make sure we're differentiating between proven versus evidence shown, right? Those are certainly not the same things.
Right. They're totally different. I agree.
Okay. All right. So we're going to try and prove deism with the goal of eventually getting that to theism.
Right.
Okay. So what's your proof for deism?
Go for it.
Okay. So just straight off the bat, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. We're going with the Chris Hitchens law, and I believe that. I sincerely believe that. I also believe in Thomas Jefferson's quote, "Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more prove to the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." And when I say reason, I'm talking about both deductive and inductive reason. Okay. So where do we start? So at the basement level, we start with agnosticism, I, not an A, or atheism. I'm sure you've heard of those. So that's the subset of atheism that is like, well, we don't even have, a coherent or consistent definition of God in order to prove one. So we need that first. You need to define your terms before attempting to do proof of evidence. So
let's define your deist God. What are the parameters that we're trying to look for?
So we need to consistently define God, not according to any proper names. That's where people get thrown off. We're not going for any proper names at this point, maybe much later on down the process, but at this point, we need to define God according to his attribute, or according to an attribute, okay?
Yeah, this is not new. Like, people have been defining God by attributes. That's where the Kalam and various iterations of that come from, right? Right. Okay, so how is yours different than Kalam?
Right.
Or is it Kalam?
It's not Kalam. No,
okay.
It's not Kalam at all. Though it may use components of Kalam, but I do understand the weaknesses of that argument, so that's why I reject that argument. So the only consistent and reliable definition of God that I seek to prove is omnipotence. Why that one? Anything falling short of that attribute in all fairness is disqualified from consideration.
Why?
In the Oxford English Dictionary, omnipotence is defined as all-powerfulness or almightiness. And just as another disclaimer, I'm not trying to prove that.
Okay, Paul, real quick. I know, Paul.
Go ahead.
Okay, I get the sense that you've done a lot of research and you've got this like out in bullet points or something, which is great. I love it when people bring research, as long as they're not sticking directly to the script and can have conversation, which I think we're good with.
Yeah, sure.
My question for you is, where did you come across omnipotence as the thing? Because there are even versions of Christianity where God is not omnipotent. So why pick that one term?
It's the weirdest thing. Jeff D, actually. I was a huge fan of Dungeons and Dragons since I was a little kid. And I was really wrestling with the which God, the Ricky Gervais. Well, it's not limited to Ricky Gervais, but I first heard it from him. The which God question, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thumbing through a Dungeons and Dragons book illustrated by Jeff D, because he was an artist at the time. And I'm looking at all of these gods it was the Deities and Demigods book, and I'm like, wow, they all got numbers and statistics listed next to them. One god is more powerful than another. One god is limited to this pantheon. One god is limited to this. And I'm like, wow, I wonder, what am I looking for? What am I trying to prove here? And I'm like, well, it would have to be a being.
Yeah, we're waiting on that one.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah,
but have to be a being within.
But all of those other ones, like all of those other gods that you were just looking at, they're all gods that aren't omnipotent, aren't they? So why is omnipotence a feature of a god? Like, why, if you did discover something that was omnipotent, why would that be a god? And then also, why does a god need to be omnipotent when you've kind of just given examples of real world Dungeons and Dragons gods that aren't? Like, why are those two features connected? Being a god,
I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed with all of these named beings, right? And I'm trying to figure out, okay, which god, right? And
my one.
You have to have something. Go ahead. Sorry.
You didn't answer Katie's question. I think you're trying to get on with your point, and you're very well spoken. I think this could be a great essay or thesis. We want to make sure we're having a conversation. So Katie asked, why did you choose omnipotence as your qualifier for God? And isn't that disproven by the fact that there are so many gods that are not omnipotent?
Okay. So answer one. Sorry, I apologize for getting ahead.
It's okay.
One, omnipotence is the only consistent definition, a consistent and clear definition for God that I can see that cuts through all the crap.
How do you determine what's crap and what isn't?
Because we're addressing it from an atheistic perspective. We're addressing all of these conflicting names with all of these abilities, cultures, and they vary so much. How do you determine which one is right? And so you need kind of a compass or a mean, something that is consistent and clear. And so I'm hearing atheists and agnostics saying, yeah, we need that up front because there's just so much static. We have to cut through the static.
And I get that, and I like that you're acknowledging this, but the point here is that why are you not going down the route of, there are gods, they're just limited in power, and also they have been dead for a while, right? Like, you could go in that direction as well. Why are you picking this one direction of omnipotence?
I can't go down that direction because of the which God argument. Does that make sense? I can't go down that route because.
Okay.
Is that just avoiding someone's argument rather than confronting it?
Atheists actually have great questions that are really relevant to the discussion. And I'm looking at some of their questions. I'm like, yeah, they've got a really great point here. The which God argument really has to be answered, and that's a big one. Mm-hmm. And so I took that with seriousness, with great care. And so in order to cut through all of that, what do we mean by God? How do we define God? And so I'm going with omnipotence, and the reason why is to cut through the static for consistency.
So it's kind of an arbitrary choice because there are some other
litmus test for all other claims.
Paul,
go ahead.
There are some other properties that lots of different gods are said to have, like omnipresence, for example. And you could say, you've kind of arbitrarily picked omnipotent because, that is a thing that people often say about gods. My God's all powerful.
Oh, yeah.
But why pick that over omnipresence? Like, maybe there's this one God in one culture which is omnipotent, and another one which is just omnipresent, and one which is both, and one which is neither. And you're saying, well, I'm picking omnipotence because I've got to pick something to define. And that's a good point. Right. You need to know what you're trying to argue. But it is just an arbitrary choice, unless you're saying it's not an arbitrary choice, I guess is what the point we're making.
Well, essentially, that's the goal. I mean, that's what I'm hearing when I hear God. If you're saying this God, so let's consider, for example, let's take Thor. Okay, you can claim, if you're a worshiper of Thor, you can claim Thor is omnipotent. Great. How do we test for that? You look at the mythology, you look at the claims being made of Thor. He's limited to one sphere of influence, thunder, lightning, weather, maybe war, fighting, just off the top of my
Maybe he just likes those things. Maybe he's omnipotent and he just really likes lightning, so he spends all his time doing that.
The bigger question here, though,
by Freya, right?
Paul, the bigger question here is, yes, I agree that other forms of gods, especially pantheons, especially in different pagan and neo-pagan groupings, they all have their own area of expertise, let's say, right? And everybody focuses on that one thing and does that thing. And, that explains the chaos in the universe for some people. My concern here is that you're trying to get away from the difficult questions by finding a way through to something that you can prove. And while on one hand, sure, like we want
to find a solution.
Right, but you're trying to find a solution that still clings to a very specific kind of God. And this is my problem with things like process theology, where they're taking...
Theism.
I know, but your goal is to get to theism, right?
Eventually.
Yeah. So here's the deal. Here's the deal.
That goal yet? I mean, that's way down the line.
I know. I'm not critiquing the argument. I'm critiquing the way that the argument is being formulated and the motivation behind it. I love that you're listening to atheists and taking that in. I would encourage you to try and get a little bit deeper and say, okay, why are these arguments hitting? What do we actually know? And your example about Thor is actually quite compelling to me, because you said, how do we know if Thor is all powerful? Where we look at the mythology and we look at the stories. Stories and mythology do not prove the existence of a thing. So before we even look at the attributes, we have to see if it exists in something apart from the stories we're telling about it, right? So what we're trying to get to, Paul...
disqualified, then I can come up with pretty much anything, any definition of God that I want. Instead of saying, well,
and that's the problem.
That's kind of the issue.
Okay, I could just say then those haven't been proven yet. I mean, I'm still good. I'm still in the open. I haven't disqualified myself. I haven't made any errors yet. No objective errors.
Well, the error would be believing in a thing before it can be proven or disproven.
Agreed. How did I do that?
Well, if you said, well, I believe in a God that just can't be proven yet, I'm just picking random attributes, the issue would be that you're picking random attributes for a being that we don't know whether or not exists.
We're still at the definitional stage.
Okay. I don't think we're ever getting out of the definitional stage at this point. Paul, I think that this conversation would be great to have on the Facebook page or in the Discord. I think it's going to work a lot better written out. Or if you want to get down to it, we can certainly have you back on the show. I think we're going to move on to the next caller. But I would encourage you to think a little bit about why you're so motivated to reduce this God down to something you can prove just so you can keep a hold of it. Because I think that is going to get you a lot farther than trying to pick attributes willy-nilly.
It does feel like that you're like, coming up with arguments to dodge around criticisms rather than like coming at them head on.
Yeah.
I'm having to avoid the which God question. So what I'm going to do is come up with a reason why I don't have to answer the which God question.
Exactly. And this is kind of the issue, as I was saying before, that I have with things like process theology, which is an attempt to get out of certain really, relevant questions about God, like the problem of evil and the issue of logical contradictions within an omnipresent, omnipotent.
Omnipotent is a good example of if you're picking that as a God, like that one feature I would say was impossible. So that alone really is kind of an argument against picking that as something to prove.
Right. And the goal here is to see if there is reason to believe in a God at all, not to find a version of God that can dodge all of the arguments.
I also think this is kind of backwards how you would do anything else, like everything else that you know exists is because you've seen the evidence, and then you're like, oh, what is that? You know, why am I suddenly wet now I've gone outside? Oh, it's because of rain. You didn't sort of sit inside and be like, oh, I'm defining this idea of like there's got to be something coming out the sky, and so and we can't talk about which chemical, so I'm just going to say that, you know, things that fall out of the sky. It's like, it's kind of the wrong way around. You need to see the evidence and then work out what it is from that.
Right. And there's a difference there again between, you know, what we consider to be the scientific process and the philosophical process, right? Even though they're interlinked, you can hypothesize about a thing philosophically all day and prove it with words by putting them in the right order. But at the end of the day, that's meaningless unless you have something to back up that it actually exists in the real world.